first of all, it's great to see that you are organizing this discussion on the Occupational Health Day, because I think it's really critical for people now to think about the return to work and what we are now calling the new normal should be. I think early in the year it was hoped by many that countries which had taken very strict and stringent action in terms of lockdown and really stringent action on physical distancing and other public health measures, that they would see a decline in the outbreak and that this would be sustained and people could go back to life as normal. But as this has been unfolding over the last few months, as Dr. Rajagopal just mentioned, in fact, the speed of increase is accelerating. It's growing at an exponential pace. It's moving around the world and has reached practically every country in the world. I think there are just a few small island states that have been able to keep the virus out, but otherwise it's gone everywhere. Of course, the speed at which it has increased and the impact it's had on the communities and societies has varied depending on many factors, including the most important factor being when and what action was taken by governments and by communities. And we can see a clear relationship actually between leadership, good governance, and a good public health system and the outcome, at least so far. But it's also very clear that no country and no community is going to be safe for very long. And as we are seeing, even places which thought they had it fully under control, including in China, there are outbreaks, there are clusters, an unexpected return of infection. We've also understood a lot more about this virus now, including the modes of transmission. I'd like to spend a couple of minutes on this because it's been in the news recently, and I think it's quite relevant for workplace settings. Now, from the beginning, we knew that because it's a coronavirus, even though we didn't know much about the epidemiology of this infection, but from the past behavior of other coronaviruses, we had said that this is a respiratory droplet infection, spreads from person to person, mainly through large respiratory droplets, which means close physical contact is needed. Also through fomites, because droplets can fall on fomites, and then fomites can be touched by people and then transferred to the face, nose, mouth, and ears. And also that small particles, the small respiratory droplets or aerosols, could be generated in certain settings. And those settings were considered to be those healthcare settings where there is procedures done on the patient which results in aerosolization, like intubation, like giving high flow oxygen, mechanical ventilation. And so healthcare workers who are around the patient in such settings were considered at very high risk and were, to be given the best personal protective equipment. Now, as time has gone by, it has also become evident through the descriptions of many settings, outbreaks in a choir in a church, outbreaks in a pub, outbreaks in a dormitory, outbreaks in a call center, outbreak in a ship, that this virus could also spread to people who are not necessarily within 1 meter distance and in prolonged close contact, but within the same closed environment, probably because these respiratory droplets, the smaller ones, less than 5 microns in size, can remain suspended in the air for some length of time. We don't know whether it is in minutes or hours, particularly when there's no ventilation, or if it's a closed recirculated air, which then exposes people in that room to this virus. And if they are there together for a certain length of time, and if there's somebody in that group who's infectious and is coughing, talking, singing, shouting, or even breathing, that this is possible. And there are a lot of engineers who have come into this debate and who have talked about how even normal breathing can result in aerosolization of particles. So there is one group of scientists who's been looking at the experimental evidence as to whether aerosols can be generated or not when we are breathing or talking or singing. And there's another group of people who are looking at the public health evidence to say, how common is this? So I think the situation where the public can start panicking is if they think that this is an airborne virus like the measles virus, which just spreads very, very rapidly. The measles virus has a R naught of something like 15 or 20, which means that it spreads closer to the measles. And if this virus had been like measles, we would have seen much, much more infection than what we've seen. The fact that many countries have been able to contain it by doing these measures of testing and tracking and treating and isolating means that it's not such a widespread airborne. But in these closed settings where the ventilation is poor, it is possible that more people can get infected if they are in contact with an individual. But we are asking for more research. So just 2 days ago, we updated the scientific brief on the modes of transmission because WHO was being the big debate on the modes of transmission. So I think it's important to understand that. Now, what are the implications for workplace settings? There's a good document that I'd like to refer you to, which was developed by the ILO and the WHO to go through a list of 10 elements of what you have to think about when workplaces, especially now that workplaces are being opened and people are coming back. And those include, basic things, but they also include a risk assessment of what is a worker's risk, both the individual risk. So if you're individual with diabetes, hypertension, you're over the age of 55 or 60, or you have other underlying immunosuppressive conditions, then you are at higher risk. So there's an individual risk. There's also the risk with respect to the environment and the proximity of people. And as I mentioned, the ventilation in that environment. And these are things we have to think about. The authorities or the administration of that workplace, whether it's a school or a business or an office or a mall or a factory, needs to think about and put in place measures. And apart from the hand hygiene and the respiratory etiquette and the availability of disinfectants and soap and water to wash hands frequently, etc., one additional precaution may be to insist on the wearing of masks, particularly if people are going to be working in close proximity to each other, in closed settings where there is not much of natural ventilation. Wherever possible, we encourage doors and windows to be kept open, air circulation. If it's air conditioned, it should be not recirculated air, but fresh air to the extent possible. But where all this is not possible, then wearing of masks could reduce, the source of infection by preventing the droplets from actually coming out and getting into the air around. So perhaps I could stop there with the remarks and then hand it over back to Dr. Rajagopal, but I'll stay on if there are additional questions that come up. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Swaminathan. I'm sure there are additional questions because I don't think anybody would miss an opportunity like this where we can question the chief scientist of the WHO, especially with your vast public health background. Before I actually hand over to the rapporteurs to, select the questions from the audience and ask you, I was just wanting to ask you a question myself. Recent reports actually have stated that even in a place like Spain, which had a huge infection, community serology studies show that just 5% of the population were infected. And New York and other places also, it hardly crosses 10%. So the concern here is that, that's why I said, forget the concept of herd immunity. The concern here is that what is happening to this virus? We have seen in earlier episodes, SARS and MERS dying out on their own. Just when we about to make a vaccine for SARS, the human trials were not even started, it just died out. Are we seeing something repeating itself? Because otherwise you have a virgin population waiting to be reinfected again. So what is your view of how this virus is evolving? And of course, we can't lower down our guard. But what do you see happening in the future when you see that even after so much rampant infection and deaths and all, we still don't seem to be having many people infected?
That's a very good question, Dr. Rajagopal. And obviously, we don't know, we cannot predict everything about this virus. But what we have seen, as you rightly said, this virus has been going around the world, and because it has found a susceptible population, and again, I should say there's a lot of work going on in immunology now looking at cross protection, because as you know, this is not the first coronavirus. Human beings have been exposed to at least 6 other coronaviruses. Many of them cause the common cold. but we don't know how much cross protection there is. So that's work that's going on. But yes, even in the places which have been heavily impacted, less than 10% of the population has antibodies, means that they have been exposed to this virus. So from that, what we can gather is that for the foreseeable future, this virus can continue to come and spread, maybe in waves. People have talked about first wave, second wave, but in many parts of the world, we have not even seen the end of the first wave. We've seen a sort of a peak going down and then a second peak emerging. And in other countries, like including India, where there has been no peak, it's basically been on a slow uphill curve. So the peak depends on what action is taken to bring it down, because it will not happen naturally till the entire population is or a sizable proportion is infected. But coming back to the immunity of this virus, again, an important element is the fact that a large number of people are asymptomatic and exposed. So something that these antibody surveys have shown is that it's only about 1 in 10 people who seem to get diagnosed, either because the rest of them don't have symptoms or they have very mild symptoms. They don't even go to a doctor. They don't get tested. So you can multiply approximately by 10 times the number of infected people in the community compared to the number of detected people. The second thing is that people can spread the infection even when they don't have symptoms. So there's something called pre-symptomatic. So before somebody develops symptoms, the viral load in the respiratory tract can be quite high for about 2 to 3 days before the symptoms and for a few days after, 5 to 7 days after. So that infectious period starts before the symptoms, and so the person doesn't know they're ill. Similarly, there are a few people who, like we said, don't have very many symptoms at all, and yet they could be spreading. And usually the younger the person, the more likely that they remain asymptomatic. So there's a lot of modeling now being done to say how much of infection is going around through this people who don't know they have the infection, who are asymptomatic. It could be a significant amount, though some of the carefully done studies in China and Korea and Japan showed that the risk of spread from somebody who doesn't have symptoms is much less than the risk of spread with people who have symptoms, possibly because when you're coughing, you generally tend to expel more virus. But the risk nevertheless remains. And that's another reason why universal masking, particularly in those environments, those countries which have a lot of infection, might be the only way to prevent or reduce the spread. I won't say it will prevent 100%. And we're talking now about fabric masks, homemade masks, which can reduce the droplets from being expelled by about half, 50% or so. They're effective. And we know there's a global shortage of things like N95 masks, and it's not feasible or necessary or practical for every individual to be going around in an N95 mask. I don't think, that's why I said it's not that kind of an airborne virus where the whole world has to go around in N95 masks. But wearing either medical masks or fabric masks can protect the individual, and particularly protecting others from getting the infection. But I think this science is continuing to evolve, and sometimes people are very critical, saying that the guidance from WHO or from other agencies is not keeping up with the science. But it's a question of waiting for the evidence to evolve enough so that there's an upgrade in the guidance. But it is a challenge for all of us.
Thank you so much, for your useful insights. I can just assure you that there are very many scientific bodies across the world, almost all of them, who swear by the WHO. So yes, there will be some sort of criticisms here and there, but I think we all depend on the WHO for absolute state-of-the-art knowledge. With that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand it over to the rapporteurs, Dr. Sandeep and Ashish. They've got a lot of questions from the audience, and maybe Sandeep, you can start off first.
Thank you, Dr. Rajgopal. And Dr. Soumya Madam, we would like to know the WHO roadmap for short, medium and long-term allocation of drugs, vaccine and diagnostic for the underdeveloped world, sir.
Yes, thank you. That's a good question. Well, the short term, I can say, is basically on diagnostics, which of course were needed from day one, as well as on the treatments as they are becoming, evidence is being generated, and then I'll say about vaccines. So as far as diagnostics, there are 3 sets of diagnostics. The PCR kit, PCR or the molecular kit, which is the only reliable kit for detection of the virus currently, and it has to be done from respiratory secretions, though people are also testing it in saliva and in other body secretions. That is positive usually around the time of the first week or so of the infection, but it could, in some cases, RNA could be found in those secretions even for several weeks after the person has recovered. And it doesn't mean they're still infectious, it just means that you're still able to detect the RNA. The second type of test is the antibody test, which basically tells you about exposure to the virus. It says that you've been exposed, you could have had symptoms, you may not have had symptoms, but you now have antibodies. How long they will protect, whether they protect, etc., still remains to be seen. But a guess from other coronaviruses is that if you have antibodies, you may be protected for a year or so. For the SARS, it was a little bit longer than that, it was up to 3 years. And the third type of test is the antigen detection test, which really there's a lot of R&D going on now, because if you are able to develop a rapid antigen detection test that works on respiratory secretions, like a flu test, then that would really enable the diagnosis of this infection much more widely, because a PCR test requires lab infrastructure which is limited, especially in resource poor countries. So these are the diagnostics, and on the antigen test, we are really working with partner agencies. Now, I just want to mention something called the ACT Accelerator that was set up by WHO and global partners, launched on April 24th. The idea is to accelerate the development, research and development into diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines, but also to focus on the deployment and equitable and fair access. So WHO has worked with the other UN partners like UNICEF, World Food Programme, who are all big supply chain experts, to ensure that diagnostics particularly and PPE are made available to those countries where there's a huge shortage. And as you all remember, February, March, there were shortages globally, and countries were outbidding each other to pick up the limited global supply. Supply chains had also collapsed. A lot of stuff was coming from China. And it's very good to see that India is now completely self-reliant in the area of both diagnostics and PPE. And that's really excellent to have achieved that within a matter of a few months. As far as therapeutics are concerned, there is a lot of research going on 3 types of therapeutics: antiviral drugs, which act on the virus; immunomodulatory drugs, because we know that when people become really sick, it's because their immune system is overreacting and producing lots of cytokines and damaging the blood vessels, the lungs, etc. And the third, the antithrombotic, because we also know blood clotting is disturbed, and clots form in many parts of the body, including the lungs. And that's also responsible for some of the mortality in this. Now, as far as antivirals, we started with drugs like the anti-HIV drugs, hydroxychloroquine, remdesivir. The only drug that's having some promise to date is remdesivir, though it's not very clear as yet how much of a mortality benefit it has and in which group of patients. Anti-hepatitis drugs are also being tested. So drugs which were influenza drugs were tested but not found to be useful, like oseltamivir and favipiravir. So we need more antiviral drugs and small molecules, and I hope that some innovation will come from India in this regard. On the immunomodulatory, I am happy that there's a lot of innovation going on in that space. Then there's the monoclonal antibodies, which again, most of the innovations happening in the United States, and we worry about the access to that. It is very promising, and it will be good to see monoclonal antibody technology being scaled up in countries like India and other parts of Africa. And finally, on vaccines. Now, of course, there's a lot being written and spoken about this. We have a very robust pipeline of vaccines globally, over 150 candidates in preclinical or clinical development, at least 7 development programs in India. And we hope that some of these will be successful, but it's extremely hard right now to predict which ones will be successful and the timelines. And we're looking at, realistically speaking, the first half of 2021 to have any one of these vaccines available in some limited quantities. And again, we'll have to think about, so WHO is working with the partners and member states mainly to develop a framework and mechanism for fair and equitable allocation of these products, whether it's drugs, whether it's vaccines. If it's all going to be cornered by the rich countries, then this would have been a terrible, terrible mistake where we're repeating history. So we want to ensure that the world can come together and decide that we will first protect our frontline workers, our healthcare workers, if there's a vaccine available, that it will be in limited supplies. And then as more and more vaccine stocks are available, supplies are available, you could then go ahead and vaccinate other parts of the population. But we have to start with the ones who are most vulnerable and whom we need to protect in order to protect the healthcare system and the other critical functions of any country. So these are all being discussed and debated. And again, we need strong political leadership. And of course, as WHO keeps repeating, we need global solidarity for this pandemic to be brought under some kind of control. Back to you.
Thank you, madam. Now, Dr. Ashish, next question.
Sure. So basically, we're getting people back to work now with economies opening up. A huge concern on the offices still lie with the central air conditioning and ventilation in general. And now with this backdrop of the discussions around airborne transmissions, what is that we can do to assure our employees in terms of their safety at workplace from COVID-19 in a centrally air conditioned environment?
So the other panelists may also wish to comment, and I think one needs to also hear from the engineers about how to make workplaces safe. But as I mentioned before, the basic principles are to try to maintain as good as ventilation as possible, natural ventilation preferably, and to maintain a current of air, circulation of air, so that these particles don't hang around in the same closed environment. The second is for people to try and avoid these kind of spaces where they cannot maintain physical distancing, and to try to work remotely, for example, or from home. Many businesses are able to successfully work from home, but we know that there are many workplaces where you have to be in person. You cannot work from home. And then the masking, asking everybody to wear a mask and to do it properly, because it's not so easy. We've seen examples from places where the masks themselves are being very poorly used and maintained, and especially in poorer countries where people are sharing masks, they are not washing it, so that can actually cause more harm as well. And then, so these are some responsibilities that employers could actually take on board to make sure that they are planning and that they are involving the workers also in the planning, how to maintain hygiene, how to have enough water sanitation facilities, how to maintain respiratory etiquette, to have some screening and surveillance of health workers so that people who are sick can be identified and given leave without any penalties, asking people to stay at home if they're sick because it's good for everyone else. And so encouraging them to do that. So there are many things, and as I said, this document produced by ILO and WHO actually lists all the elements. And one thing I should mention, not forget, is the psychosocial support. Because through all of this, the last few months, what people have gone through and they've suffered, is not to be underestimated. Tremendous amount of mental stress on people because of the situation that they find themselves in. Many people, of course, have lost their job, but even those who have not would be under a lot of stress. And so it's very, very important also to provide the psychosocial support in addition to the medical and the physical needs of people.
Ma'am, after this lockdown, now during this unlock, we are gradually ramping up our production in industries, and now gradually the laborers, contract workers, they are now coming. And now what should be the testing strategy for all these workers so that industries, they can be guided to screen the affected person? Should they go for mass testing of those workers, or it should be selective? What should be the strategy for them regarding testing, ma'am?
So regarding testing, I think it depends. As I mentioned, there are three kinds of testing. Now, the test for the virus, the PCR test or the antigen test, once it is available, will be positive only for a period of time when that individual has the infection. So if you test today, it doesn't mean that tomorrow you cannot get the infection. And so unless you're working in a very high risk environment, a regular PCR testing may not be practical, but there are some suggestions that have been made that people who are at high risk, you can do even pooled testing. So you can take the sample of 10 people, pool it, do the test. If it's negative, it tells you that these people are negative. So that's the kind of a thermometer check maybe for a place which employs a large number of people is periodically do pool testing to make sure that your facility is free of infection. Antibody test, again, you could do it. I think the ICMR has released some results which show that less than 1% of rural population was antibody positive. The results for the urban areas, I don't think has been released as yet, but one does hear that it's quite high, maybe 20, 30%, but that's, I think, in some pockets of the big cities where there was a lot of infection. Again, one could do it as an exercise in surveillance to know what proportion of your people are positive. But I think it's more important to pay attention to the environments where they are living and where they are working. We have seen even in places like Singapore, there have been massive outbreaks in the migrant worker dormitories, also in the Middle East, in Germany. So wherever these migrant workers have been housed in places which, are devoid of ventilation, are devoid of basic water sanitation, these outbreaks can occur. So important to remember that what are the environments where this can occur and how do you watch for it? And there could be a series of things that is done. But some workplaces, if they want to be extra careful, may want to implement this kind of a pooled testing approach, or it could be more of general precautions, and then make sure that you have medical team available to actually screen and test. Like, for example, every morning I have to fill up a form before I go to work that I'm feeling well, that I'm not sick. And that if I'm sick, I have to stay home and I'm supposed to call the doctor and they'll advise me what I'm supposed to do. So just simple things like that.